Life with Laura always seemed picture-perfect to anyone looking in from the outside. We had been married for 10 years, built a comfortable life together, and shared a bond that felt unshakable. Our routines were simple yet fulfilling. Weekends at the farmer's market, movie nights on the couch, and long talks over morning coffee. I worked as a photographer, running a small studio downtown that specialized in weddings and portraits. It was a career I loved, one that let me capture the happiest moments of people's lives. Laura, on the other hand, was a wildlife biologist. Her job took her into forests and wetlands, often for days at a time, where she studied ecosystems and the creatures that thrived within them. Her passion for nature was one of the things I had always admired about her. She had a way of talking about the world that made you see its beauty in a new light. Her job was demanding, but she loved it, and I supported her wholeheartedly, even when it meant long stretches apart. Our relationship had always been rooted in trust. We knew how to navigate the distance, to stay connected through calls and texts even when she was far away. I never doubted her. Laura was steady, grounded, the kind of person you could rely on. But looking back, maybe I should have paid closer attention. It started with a peculiar opportunity. Laura was invited to join an exclusive research project deep in the heart of a remote rainforest. It was a rare chance to work alongside world-renowned scientists, studying an ecosystem untouched by modern development. She was thrilled, and I was genuinely happy for her. The trip was set to last 6 weeks, with limited communication due to the remoteness of the area. We discussed the logistics, how we'd keep in touch when possible, and what I'd do to keep myself busy while she was gone. The morning she left, I drove her to the airport. She was practically glowing with excitement, her gear packed neatly into a single duffel bag. As we said our goodbyes, she kissed me on the cheek and promised to bring back stories of her adventures. "Don't forget to email when you can," I reminded her, though I knew it might not be often. She nodded, waved one last time, and disappeared into the terminal. For the first week, everything felt normal. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra clients to keep busy. Laura emailed once, a brief note saying she'd arrived safely and that the place was even more incredible than she'd imagined. Then the updates stopped. I assumed it was because of the limited communication she'd mentioned, but as the weeks dragged on, an unshakable unease settled over me. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It wasn't until she returned 6 weeks later that everything in our perfect life began to fall apart. When Laura came back from her trip, she seemed like herself, or at least close enough that I didn't think much of it at first. She hugged me at the airport, told me how much she'd missed me, and filled the drive home with stories about the work her team had done. She talked about the wildlife, the challenges they faced in the field, and even shared a few funny anecdotes about her colleagues. It was what I'd expected to hear, but something about her felt just a little different. At home, she fell back into our routine quickly, but there was an air of restlessness about her. She'd always been driven, but now she seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. It wasn't obvious. Laura wasn't distant or cold. She still laughed at my jokes and joined me for dinner every evening. But there was a spark missing, a subtle shift in how she interacted with me. The first time I noticed it was during one of our regular movie nights. Usually, she'd curl up beside me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder as we watched. But this time, she sat at the far end of the couch, her focus drifting to her phone more than once. I tried to reassure myself, thinking it was a long trip. She'll settle back in. But she didn't. Laura started making more plans to meet up with her colleagues from the trip, dinners, drinks, and the occasional weekend meetup. She said it was all work-related, a way to debrief after such an intense project. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd always been close with her team, and I didn't want to come across as controlling. Still, something gnawed at me. One night, while she was out, I found myself staring at my phone, debating whether to call her. I wasn't suspicious, not exactly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing. When Laura came home later that evening, she was in high spirits, laughing softly to herself as she hung up her coat. She told me about the dinner, how great it was to reconnect with her team and how they were already talking about their next project. Her smile was genuine, but as I watched her talk, I noticed something I hadn't before. She wasn't looking at me. For the next few weeks, life seemed to settle back into its rhythm. Or at least, that's how it looked on the surface. Laura was as friendly and warm as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just slightly off. It wasn't the big things. Those were all in place. We still had our meals together, went for walks on the weekends, and talked about our days. But it was in the little things, the details that only someone deeply familiar with their partner would notice. For one, she seemed more preoccupied than usual. When we talked, I caught her zoning out, her eyes unfocused as though she were somewhere else entirely. If I asked what she was thinking about, she'd smile and say, "Oh, just work," before quickly changing the subject. The work explanation became her go-to for everything. She started spending more evenings out, meeting up with her colleagues, or so she said. At first, I didn't question it. She had always been passionate about her career, and her enthusiasm for these outings felt genuine. But as the nights out became more frequent, I started to wonder if there was more to it than she was letting on. One evening, Laura had said she'd be meeting her team at a restaurant downtown to discuss their recent project. She left the house dressed neatly but casually, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Hours later, when she returned, something didn't add up. Her hair was down now, slightly tousled, and she had a faint trace of perfume I didn't recognize. She said the dinner went well, and gave me a quick kiss before heading to the bedroom. The smell of that unfamiliar perfume lingered in my mind long after she'd gone to bed. The next day, I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself I was imagining things. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. I started paying closer attention, not in an obvious way, but enough to notice patterns I hadn't before. For instance, Laura started becoming more protective of her schedule. She used to leave her calendar open on the kitchen counter, where we both could see it. Now, she carried it with her, tucking it into her bag or leaving it in the car. If I asked about her plans, she'd give me vague answers, saying she had meetings or errands to run. Then there was her phone. While I never believed in snooping, I couldn't help but notice how she kept it closer to her than before. If a notification came through, she'd glance at it quickly before tucking it away, offering a casual excuse about work emails or messages from her team. It wasn't outright suspicious, but the changes were enough to make me uneasy. One Friday evening, I decided to push my doubts aside and surprise her. She had mentioned she'd be working late at the lab, so I thought I'd bring her dinner, something I'd done many times before. I stopped by her favorite deli, picking up a sandwich and a coffee, and drove to her office. When I got there, the building was dark. I parked and waited for a while, thinking maybe she was running late or had stepped out for a break. But as the minutes ticked by, the parking lot remained empty, and the lights inside stayed off. My chest tightened as I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful. When I called her, she greeted me casually, saying she was just wrapping up whatever she was doing. I hesitated for a moment, my eyes on the darkened building in front of me. Trying to keep my tone neutral, I simply said I was checking in and would see her at home later. She seemed relieved by my response, saying she'd be back soon. But as I hung up, the pit in my stomach grew. When she came home later that night, she greeted me with the same warmth as always, acting as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't ignore the discrepancy, the lie. The days that followed were filled with more of those small, nagging inconsistencies. A receipt for a bottle of wine I didn't remember buying appeared in her purse. A jacket she said she'd left at work turned up in the car, smelling faintly of something floral. None of it was enough to accuse her of anything outright, but together, it painted a picture I didn't want to see. I found myself replaying her words, her actions, searching for clues I might have missed. The Laura I thought I knew was slipping away, replaced by someone who seemed to have secrets I wasn't privy to. And for the first time in our marriage, I began to wonder if I had been naive to trust her so completely. The unease gnawed at me, growing heavier with every passing day. At first, I tried to rationalize the discrepancies, the unexplained wine receipt, the dark office, the subtle changes in Laura's demeanor. But the more I tried to convince myself there was nothing to worry about, the more the doubt crept in, relentless and unshakable. It wasn't until the following weekend that the first undeniable piece of evidence surfaced. Laura had told me she'd be heading to a team lunch with her colleagues. She described it as casual, a chance to relax after the intensity of their recent project. I smiled and encouraged her to enjoy herself, trying to ignore the faint knot in my stomach as she left the house. An hour later, I realized she had left her scarf behind. It was one of her favorites, a deep blue one she wore often, and I thought she might need it. Deciding to surprise her, I grabbed the scarf and headed to the restaurant she'd mentioned. When I arrived, the parking lot was busier than I expected. I scanned the cars but didn't see hers. Still, I assumed she had parked farther away, so I went inside. The hostess greeted me warmly, but when I asked about Laura's group, her expression shifted to confusion. She apologized politely, saying she didn't think there was a reservation under that name for the day. I thanked her and stepped outside, my heart pounding. For a moment, I stood in the parking lot, staring at the scarf in my hand, unsure of what to do next. Then, almost instinctively, I checked the location tracking app we'd used a few times before when one of us misplaced our phones. The small blinking dot showed Laura's phone was nowhere near the restaurant. She was on the other side of town. I sat in the car for a long moment, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore what I'd just seen, to turn around and go home. But the thought of driving away without answers was unbearable. I started the car and followed the map, the route leading me toward an unfamiliar neighborhood. When I arrived, I parked down the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the building in front of me. It was a quaint cafe, tucked between a row of boutique shops. Through the large windows, I could see her. Laura sat at a corner table, not with a group of colleagues, but with one man. He was leaning across the table, his expression animated as he spoke. Laura laughed, her head tilting back slightly, the way she always did when she was genuinely amused. The ease between them was undeniable, their connection unmistakable. I couldn't move, my body frozen as I watched them. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, just close enough to his that their fingers could have brushed at any moment. She didn't look away, her focus entirely on him, as if nothing else in the world mattered. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Finally, I forced myself to leave, my chest tight and my thoughts spinning. That night, when Laura came home, she acted as though nothing had happened. She told me the lunch had gone well and mentioned a few vague details about her colleagues. Her lies were so seamless, so practiced, that I almost believed her. Almost. A few days later, more evidence surfaced. Laura had left her laptop open on the dining table, something she rarely did. I walked past it on my way to the kitchen, not intending to look, but a series of emails on the screen caught my attention. At the top of the list was a name I didn't recognize, Jason. The subject line read, "Looking forward to Friday." My stomach dropped. I hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and the need for answers. Eventually, I clicked. The email was short, but it told me everything I needed to know. Jason thanked her for their last meeting and said he couldn't wait to see her again. He mentioned how much he'd missed her and referenced a special place he was planning for their next outing. My hands shook as I read the words, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no longer any doubt. I closed the laptop and sat at the table, staring at nothing as the weight of it all pressed down on me. The woman I had trusted with everything, the woman I had built my life with, was hiding something that shattered the foundation of our marriage. For the first time, I began to think about what came next. Not just how to confront her, but what it meant for us, for everything we'd built. I knew there was no turning back now. The unease continued to grow, pressing down on me with a weight I could no longer ignore. The cafe, the emails, everything was pointing to a betrayal I couldn't yet bring myself to fully accept. I needed to know for certain. The morning after I discovered the emails, I watched Laura as she got ready for work. Her demeanor was calm, the same cheerful air she always carried, but now it felt different, manufactured. As she kissed me goodbye and walked out the door, I couldn't help but wonder where the real Laura, the woman I thought I knew, had gone. That evening, I told her I'd be staying late at work, a lie that felt justified under the circumstances. She said she was meeting with her colleagues for dinner and wouldn't be back until late. Her smile was as bright as ever, but my stomach churned as I watched her leave. Once she was gone, I followed. I parked a block away from her office and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't long before she appeared, walking briskly toward a nearby cafe. I sat in my car, watching as Jason pulled up. He stepped out of his car, his movements casual and confident, and greeted her with an easy familiarity that made my stomach twist. They entered the cafe together, taking a table in the far corner. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language said enough. They leaned in close, their heads tilted toward each other, their laughter punctuating the distance between them. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't here to act impulsively. I was here to gather the truth. After about an hour, they left the cafe together. I followed at a safe distance, expecting them to part ways. Instead, Jason led her to his car, and Laura climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. I tailed them as they drove through the city, taking a route that led to a residential neighborhood. My chest tightened as Jason pulled into the driveway of a modest two-story house. Laura got out of the car, her movements unhurried, and followed him inside. I parked a few houses down, my car hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree. The minutes ticked by, each one amplifying the storm of emotions brewing inside me. My mind raced with possibilities, but the truth was already clear. Laura wasn't at a team dinner, and Jason wasn't just a friend. After nearly an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of the car and approached the house, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The curtains were drawn, but faint laughter and voices filtered through the thin walls. I walked around the side of the house, searching for a way to confirm what I already knew. Finally, I found a small gap in the blinds of a side window. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Laura and Jason sat on the couch, their bodies close, her hand resting on his knee. They weren't talking anymore. They were kissing, their movements unrestrained and deeply personal. I stepped back from the window, my chest tightening as a surge of anger and betrayal washed over me. My heart pounded in my ears as I clenched my fists, the urge to confront them boiling just beneath the surface. But I stopped myself, taking a deep breath and walking back to my car. When Laura came home that night, I was waiting. She walked through the door with the same smile she always wore after these dinners, acting as though nothing was amiss. I asked her how her evening had been, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. She smiled and launched into a vague explanation about her colleagues and their conversations. Her lies felt like poison in the air. "I know where you were," I finally said, cutting her off. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before she composed herself, asking me what I meant. I told her about the cafe, about Jason, about following them to his house. Her face paled as I spoke, but she quickly recovered, launching into a series of excuses. She claimed it wasn't what it looked like, that Jason was just a friend, that I was reading too much into things. But her words rang hollow. When I mentioned seeing them through the window, her defenses crumbled. She tried to justify it, saying she hadn't meant for things to go this far, that she'd been feeling lost and needed someone to talk to. Her voice wavered, but I couldn't feel sympathy. Not now. I told her that her excuses didn't matter, that she had betrayed me, betrayed us. Her face hardened then, her guilt giving way to defiance. She accused me of neglecting her, of not being enough, of failing to see her needs. Her words were meant to hurt, and they did. But they didn't change the truth of what had happened. The silence after I confronted her was suffocating. Laura stood frozen, the color drained from her face, as if my words had pulled the ground from beneath her feet. The weight of everything I had said hung between us, heavy and unrelenting. I didn't give her time to process it. My voice was cold and unyielding as I told her that if she had chosen this path, if Jason was what she wanted, then she needed to pack her things and leave. The words felt final, a line drawn in the sand that neither of us could cross back over. For a moment, she didn't react, as though the severity of my words hadn't sunk in. Then, her composure cracked, and she tried to protest, her voice trembling as she said it was all a mistake, something we could work through. She insisted that she hadn't meant for things to go so far, that she still cared about me, still loved me. Her desperation only deepened my anger. She wasn't apologizing for what she had done. She was trying to salvage what she had broken, as if words alone could undo the damage. She moved closer, reaching out as though to bridge the chasm between us, but I stepped back, unwilling to let her manipulate the moment. I couldn't stop myself from pointing out the lies, the deceit, the choices she had made repeatedly to betray me. Her defenses rose quickly, her voice growing louder as she claimed that I had neglected her, that she had felt invisible in our marriage. She didn't seem to realize or care that her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper. Her argument felt hollow, an attempt to deflect the blame rather than own her actions. Every excuse she gave, every justification, only solidified my decision. I couldn't let her stay, not after everything. I told her again, calmly but firmly, that she needed to pack her things and leave. At that, the fight seemed to drain out of her. She sank into a chair, her face in her hands, her voice breaking as she begged me to reconsider. She promised to end things with Jason, to do whatever it took to make things right. But her promises felt meaningless. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was gone, replaced by a chasm too wide to cross. I told her as much, my words laced with the cold finality of someone who had nothing left to give. The argument stretched on, her tone shifting from pleading to frustrated, then angry. She tried to turn the blame back onto me, saying that my shortcomings had pushed her to this point. I listened, but her accusations didn't land. They felt like the flailing of someone unwilling to face the consequences of their actions. Eventually, she stopped arguing. She stood and walked toward the bedroom, her steps slow and heavy. I stayed in the living room, staring at the clock, the sound of drawers opening and closing in the background a reminder of the life that was unraveling around me. When she finally emerged with her bags, her eyes were red and swollen, her shoulders slumped under the weight of what had happened. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle as though she was waiting for me to stop her. I didn't. As the door closed behind her, the house felt unbearably quiet. The relief I had expected didn't come right away. Instead, there was a hollow ache, a reminder of everything we had lost. Not just the good moments, but the version of us I had once believed was unbreakable. But even in that emptiness, there was a flicker of something else. Freedom. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was mine to walk, free of lies and betrayal. In the days after Laura left, the house felt heavy with the memories of what had been. But this time, the silence didn't suffocate. It gave me the space to think, to process, and to start figuring out what came next. I contacted a lawyer almost immediately. The decision to divorce wasn't one I needed to dwell on. The trust between us was gone, and there was no future to salvage. Thankfully, the process was straightforward. The house was mine. It had been before we married, and there was no debate about who would keep it. Laura moved in with a friend while the proceedings played out. During the divorce, she tried to argue for a share of the house, claiming she had contributed to the mortgage and upkeep. But my lawyer was thorough, and the judge ruled in my favor. She left with little more than her personal belongings, her anger at the outcome evident during every interaction. When the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. What we had was officially over, but there was freedom in that finality. I decided to stay in the house, at least for the time being. It was mine, and I wasn't going to let her betrayal drive me away from the place I had worked so hard to build. But I made changes, big ones. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and removed anything that reminded me of Laura. It was no longer our home. It was mine. Work became my escape. I threw myself into projects, spending long hours at the studio and taking on clients I had previously turned away. My colleagues noticed the shift in me, but I didn't share the details. To them, I was just someone navigating the end of a marriage, and that was enough. Outside of work, I started rebuilding my life. I joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I reconnected with old friends, spending evenings catching up over beers and laughter. Slowly, I began to rediscover the person I had been before my marriage, the person who had been lost in the shuffle of trying to make a broken relationship work. I heard little from Laura after the divorce. Once, she sent me a message, saying she missed me and asking if I could ever forgive her. I didn't respond. There was no point. Forgiveness might come in time, but it wouldn't change what had happened or bring back what we had lost. Looking back, I realized how much I had ignored in our relationship, the subtle signs of disconnection and unhappiness that I had chosen not to see. Her betrayal wasn't just a sudden, catastrophic event. It was the culmination of cracks that had been forming for years. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. A relationship can't survive on routine or habit. It needs trust, communication, and effort from both people. Without those, love can wither, no matter how strong it once was. Now, as I sit in my home, with a cup of coffee and the quiet hum of life around me, I feel a peace I didn't think was possible. The road ahead is still uncertain, but it's mine to walk, and for that, I am grateful. Share your thoughts about this situation in the comments.